and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. So glad to have you, as always. Today we're going to be talking about Violet, which very well may be the most chill, easy, and content warning-free research process I have done thus far for the series, and I'm very, very excited about it, especially because the one I'm doing for next month is like over 10 adaptations, and I keep working on that one and thinking about how much I missed this one, because this one was just so lovely. Quick introduction and housekeeping things before we get started. Hi, I'm Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a multi-hyphenate, a lot of things that generally fit somewhere in the range between academia and the performing arts. For the purposes of this video, I am an actor disability dramaturg, and I have a specific research focus in accessible education, minority media analysis, and accessible theater. And in this series, we break down shows that involve disabled characters and disabled stories to prove that we've always been a part of the theater canon, and we always will be, learn a little bit of critical thinking, media analysis skills, and talk about different ways to ethically stage already existing shows that include disability, always with a focus on critiquing the wider industry and pushing it forward with a cool, that happened, now what, view of things. There's no judgment, there's no specific call-outs here, that's not my style, and also the wider system is the issue, not any individuals. Not to mention that this field is moving quite quickly, so things become outdated really, really fast. It's a great time, I always learn a lot making these, I hope that you enjoy them as well. Also, shameless plug while we're here, if you enjoy the series or any of my others and you want to support me, I do have a Patreon with lots of perks and whatnot, and it's part of the reason I'm able to spend a godforsaken amount of time at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts to make these videos for you. So you're welcome to join Patreon if you want. I also recently discovered that nearly 2/3 of my viewers are not subscribed, so you can support me by doing that or by liking or commenting if you want. All those options are free, but no pressure in any direction. Do whatever sparks joy for you. I'm just sharing the options. What else am I forgetting? Oh, for friends who need it, I am a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing a red dress that has flowers on it and a tan sweater that's really warm, and I'm wearing it for cosplay purposes, but honestly I'll probably take it off shortly. And I'm sitting in front of a playing ball that has green leaves on it. Amazing! The plan of action for today, we're going to be doing a brief history of the show. We're going to go over the plot. Spoilers, obviously. We're going to go through the iterations of the story and the two major productions, and then we're going to talk about disability narratives. Fantastic, amazing, let's dive in. So, Violet is a musical with music by Jeanine Tesori and book by Brian Crawley, based on the 1969 short story The Ugliest Pilgrim by Doris Betts. That story was also adapted into an Oscar-winning 1981 short film that every single person I've ever talked to about the show did not know existed, so I can only assume that it has absolutely no impact on the show itself. The musical was developed in 1994 at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center's National Music Theater Conference. That's so many words, which eventually became a short run off-Broadway at Playwrights Horizons as directed by Susan Schulman in 1997. It won a bunch of awards, and then they did a 2003 reunion concert. Also, in case I forget to say it at any other point in this video, off-Broadway is really important and really great, and you should go watch shows off-Broadway. Please go do it. Support off-Broadway more, specifically Playwrights Horizons. Great. Violet's second life began in 2013, which was the first year of Encore's Off Center, led by founding artistic director Jeanine Tesori. On July 17th, in 2013, they did a concert of Violet starring Sutton Foster and directed by Lee Silverman, which then ended up transferring to Broadway in March of 2014, where it ran until August. There's also an off-West End production in 2019, but I couldn't find out a lot about that, so I didn't include it here, and obviously the show is done regionally a lot. This is a very common regional show. I should also mention that a bunch of changes were made for the 2013 revival, which we will get to later, but the show itself can best be described as a slice of life, a sort of religious parable-esque chamber piece. It's one of those things where you hear the plot and you're like, okay, so? And then you listen to the soundtrack or you go see the show and you feel like you're being hugged and you can't stop thinking about the story and you can't quite explain why, which is honestly one of my favorite kinds of shows. Illinois has a very similar energy to this. Like, there's a fine line between this is a study of humanity to the point where the plot goes nowhere and I feel antsy, and like a simple story that moves gently and kind of carries you through reflections on humanhood, and I feel like Violet sits firmly in the second category, and I love it for that. That's just, so good. The show begins in Spruce Pine, North Carolina, where we see a 25-year-old Violet sitting on a bench waiting for the bus. She sings about how she's going to get the preacher started on her facial scar that cuts a rainbow clear across her cheek, and at the same time we see young Vi gathering split wood and singing a folk song, only to get cut off by her dad yelling, "Violet, watch out!" and her looking up horrified, which is in reference to the fact that her scar is from an axe blade hitting her in the face. We see adult Violet kind of flinch at the memory, and then little Vi goes away, and we see an interaction between her and a local guy named Leroy where he refuses to to look her straight in the face. Then the bus arrives, she gets on the bus, she drops a catechism book that an old lady picks up and asks her about, and we learn that it was her mother's, and her mother wrote a lot in the margins of this book, and now Violet writes in the margins of this book as well. And then she gets on the bus, she sits next to this old woman who is a bit of a really annoying chatterbox, and we see Violet individually judge the appearance of each person that she meets on this bus in a sort of like, well, when I get my new face, I want to have this feature of theirs, but not this one sort of way. So they're on the bus. This is intercut with a scene between young Vi telling her stern father about how the boys are teasing her for her scar, saying the deacon says it's because they don't go to church. He gives her a quarter, he tells her to go to the movies. Then we're back to the bus where they're at a rest stop in Kingsport, Tennessee. Violet sits at the counter, she orders, and the waiter comments on her scar and suggests that maybe she should go sit in a booth rather than at the counter where two soldiers from the bus, one who's black and one who's white, are sitting because racism. I forgot to mention, I'm so good at the summary bit. The summary bit is obviously my most skilled portion of these videos. The show takes place in 1964, approximately 2 months after the Civil Rights Act was signed, which ended segregation and prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in this country. Obviously, legally ending discrimination does not mean discrimination actually goes away, but that is the slight social tension undercurrent throughout that's kind of important, and I should have mentioned that earlier. So the waiter says racist things to the soldiers. Their names are Flick and Monty. Flick is the black one, he kind of freezes, and Monty, the white one, looks over at Violet to see what she's gonna do. Violet turns to the waiter and she's like, well, what if I told you we're traveling together? And then Flick looks at her and she says, don't think that means anything, mister. I know what that must be like for you people. And then the three of them have a slightly like hostile back and forth, and the two men move to the table to start playing poker, to which she points out that Flick is dealing a cheated hand and is invited to join their game. As she deals the cards, we see a reflected memory of young Vi and her dad, where he's frustrated that she's once again shortchanged at the store because her math is bad, and so he decides to teach her about it by betting money in poker, because then she'll actually care about it. And I just have to say, from a teacher pedagogy perspective, obsessed with this. It's fantastic. But it does work. It's very effective. She becomes very good at math and also very good at poker. This earns her the respect of the men, and they ask her where she's off to. She says she's going on a pilgrimage to Tulsa to see a TV preacher who's going to heal her scar, and she's going to come home pretty. To which both Monty and Flick start laughing, and then she says something a little bit racist to Flick, and so he walks off for a bit, and Monty tells her that he thinks that her preacher won't be able to do what she wants. He's also like really, really flirty with her in a very like schoolboy kind of way, which ends up in him grabbing her book and playing keep away, and she gets really upset because that's an important thing to her, and Flick grabs it and he scolds Monty and he gives the book back to her. Cut to a scene of young Vi being scolded by her father for stealing this book, which she wasn't allowed to have until her 16th birthday. Then we cut back to the bus. This time they're stopped in Nashville, where the annoying old lady gets off and offers to Violet for her to stay with her and her son before going on to Tulsa the next day for safety reasons, but Violet declines, and the lady gets a little pointed with her, and Monty defends her and is all proud of himself for it, but then Violet scolds him for being rude about that, and then Flick defends her against Monty, but also gets a little bit smart with her, and then he and Monty kind of start arguing, and Violet's like, hi, can you not? At which point, Flick decides to use Monty's full name, Montgomery, which Violet then teasingly uses as much as humanly possible throughout the rest of the show. And then they get into talking about what she wants changed when she goes to Tulsa, but she refuses to answer, saying like, oh, you're gonna tease me, and they're like, oh, no, we promise, we're gonna behave. So she sings about all the different pieces of looks she wants to have, specifically naming a lot of movie stars, and the boys are trying to be genuinely supportive at first, but they kind of expand upon it in a way that makes her very self-conscious. We then cut to a daydream of young Vi being cured by the preacher, after which we see her on the bus avoiding the boys, but Flick comes over and tells her that they're almost to Memphis, and they talk about life, about trying to escape where they came from, how he likes his job in the military and getting to order people like Monty around, about potentially getting sent to Vietnam. Flick tries to kindly explain to Violet that TV preachers are generally frauds, and she's like, maybe, but what if he's the exception to the rule? I've tried everything, I might as well try this. And he kind of points to the fact that maybe she's so focused on one thing that probably statistically can't happen, that she's not like opening herself up to the possibility of anything else happening, and like of individually trying to take control over her own life. They then get to Memphis, and she says she's going to stay with some extended family who very much don't know that she's coming, and who she has never met before, and the men offer to let her stay with them, but she declines. Monty goes off to call her a cab, and then some men show up, assuming that Flick and Violet are together, and then they start a fight, and Monty gets back in time and gets involved in said fight, and then one of the men who was fighting them runs off with Violet's suitcase, which had her other dress and a relative's number in it, so she then agrees to stay with Flick and Monty. So they go to the boarding house Flick recommended, where the landlady is angry at him for bringing two white people there, especially potentially a white girl, because obviously that puts them all in a lot of danger, but he gives her some extra money and she reluctantly agrees as long as they use the back door when they come in and out of the establishment. They go to their separate rooms for some time and Violet lays down for a little nap, during which she dreams of little Violet going home to her father to show him her new face and him being so proud of her and how far she's come since he passed. The old lady from the bus appears in this dream and dances with her father, the old lady being about the age that her father would have been were he still alive. And then Monty appears in the dream and dances with the old lady and then dances with young Vi, and she asks him for a second dance, but then he doesn't hear her, which is like reflected in the fact that like in real life Monty has walked into her room and is seeing her asleep and picks up her book and starts reading some of what she wrote in that book. Violet wakes up and sees what he's doing and then just pretends to be asleep rather than deal with it. And then after a while Flick comes in and he's like, hello, what are you doing? I thought you came in to wake her up. Why are you just sitting here? And then they talk about how they're gonna go get plastered, at which point she wakes up and they give her a spiked Coke, and then they head out to the dance hall and have a really fun time dancing around for a while until the music gets low and Flick and Violet get pretty close, watched by some of the people there. So then Flick's like, this is weird, and so then he goes off to get them some drinks, and when he's off to get the drinks, Monty cuts in and takes Flick's place and starts dancing with Violet a lot closer, and then his hands start to wander a little bit and she just kind of rolls with it until she makes eye contact with Flick and he puts down the drinks and he walks off to give them space, and she's like, and so then she runs after Flick, and then the two of them talk in the hallway outside of their rooms with a lot of like the, hey, you want to go do stuff together subtext. But that gets cut off by the landlady and they separate for the evening somewhat reluctantly. Later in the evening, when Violet is asleep, Monty shows up in her room rather intoxicated and half asleep, and then this scene is intercut with young Vi being asked by a boy if she'd do it with him because he was bet $5 and he'll split it with her. Cut back to Monty rambling about his motorbike after he and Violet have done their business, and then he falls asleep in her lap and she sings a song, and that's the end of Act 1. Act 2 begins with all of them back on the bus pulling into the Fort Smith, Arkansas station where the boys are getting off and she's to continue on to Tulsa. Monty leaves to get her candy and soda, which he has been doing at every rest stop all day. While he's gone, Flick takes Monty's spot and gets Violet to give him her address, and they get into a little argument over the fact that he thinks Monty just sees her as an easy lay and nothing else, and she calls him jealous and is angry at him for not coming to her room that night after the landlady left, and then they get really heated and then she pushes off and goes to the bus bathroom, at which point Monty comes back onto the bus and Flick basically accuses him of not actually caring about her, and so Monty rehearses with him what he's going to say to let her down easy. Meanwhile, Violet's rehearsing in the bathroom what she's going to say to him to reject him first before he rejects her, and then she gets sick and Monty's worried about her, and she comes out of the bathroom and she's like, it's from all the candy and soda that you've been giving me all day, and you guys better go because you're going to miss your stop. And then she and Monty both go to say what they were going to say, but they both kind of mess it up, and then he says that he's going to wait for her at the station when she comes back through on her way to North Carolina, and Flick's like, Monty, what are you doing? With like a little bit of, just a little bit of jealousy. And then they leave and the bus goes off and we transition into the choir practicing with the preacher. We see him do his whole like televangelist thing. He's really magnetic, look at him go. But there's also some pieces in there where you're like, this man doesn't know anything about anybody around him at all. He's completely, entirely centered on himself and his image. And then when the lights go down and he's no longer putting on this performance, you really get to see how not great of a guy he is, including mistaking Violet for being an engineer and then yelling at her and firing her for not doing her job when she doesn't work there. And she's like, no, I'm here to be healed. And so he hands her over to Virgil, who is his second in command of sorts, to go minister to her instead of doing it himself. And as she walks off with him, she's unsure. We see a memory of young Vi being carried by her father right after the accident, trying to find a doctor, both scared out of their minds, and father telling daughter, it's gonna be okay. I promise you it's going to be okay, we're going to figure it out, when you can tell that he's really not sure. She shows the minister all of the different Bible verses that support her case that she's written down as to why she should be healed, and he tells her that he'll pray for her spirit and her inner beauty, and suffering has a purpose, and she gets frustrated and she runs off to the empty chapel, and she stands at the altar and kind of realizes that nobody else is left to testify for her, she has to do it herself. And so she starts reading her Bible quotations, and the preacher sort of rebuts it with other Bible verses saying the opposite, and he tells her to just go home. But when she refuses, he says, fine, come to the show tomorrow. And then they get in an argument where he tells her that she needs to learn to accept the fact that she's different and her scar isn't going to go anywhere. So she starts singing, sort of trying to create this miracle for herself. And then she tells the preacher to just look her straight in the face. And she gets more frantic, her book starts to fall apart, and the preacher's kind of replaced with her father, which she doesn't quite realize until she sees young Violet and follows her gaze, which leads to a confrontation with her deceased father over the scar, and he apologizes and he says how much he's racked with guilt over what happened, and he would give her the moon if he could, but he knows that he didn't do enough, and he asks her for her forgiveness. and he tells her how beautiful she is, and she takes that to assume this means she has been healed by a miracle. So with all of the confidence in the world from that, she gets back on the bus to Fort Smith, avoiding looking at her reflection the entire time, and as she gets off the bus, she sees Monty and Flick, and she's all excited to show them her new face, and Monty looks at her and he goes, "I tried to tell you what would happen, but you didn't want to hear it." And she realizes her scar's still there. She gets super embarrassed, and Monty tries to convince Violet to come with him to San Francisco before he ships out to Vietnam, and he gives her a ring that he found in his Cracker Jack because he's a child, saying that he'll replace that ring with a real one when they get there, but she's so distracted by her embarrassment about the scar mix-up, which he takes as denial, and he steps back, and she's like, "I have to get back on the bus," and Flick kind of talks her down. He says that he likes her for who she is, somebody who's different, and how he was so scared that she wasn't going to come back, and that he loves her for being one of the first people to simply look at him and see him as a person. And she effectively sings the same thing back to him, and she takes his hand, and they decide to start a new life together. And that is the end of our show. Now, some elements of this were changed slightly for the 2013-2014 revival, which we'll get to in a bit, but the bare bones of it are still the same. And also, as far as I can tell, this is the version that's currently being licensed by MTI? Maybe? The copyright in the MTI script is both 1997 and 2014, but it doesn't seem like any of the changes were retroactively put into the licensing script, so the copyright would just acknowledge that the show itself was recopyrighted in 2014. But I have two different copies of the script that are identical. One that is licensed just in the 97 and the other one that's licensed in both 97 and 2014. So I'm assuming the change was not made. However, the MTI website doesn't offer a one-act version. So I don't know what's going on with that. I've spoken to several people who've done it regionally recently, and they had the two-act version. So I think that's the version that's being licensed and not the one-act version. But either way, that's what we're working with today. Now, the short story that is based on The Ugliest Pilgrim was published in the annual magazine titled The Red Clay Reader in 1969. For some reason, MTI does say that it was published 4 years later than that. That is the only source I have found to use that date, and I don't know where that came from. But basically, The Red Clay Reader was a literary magazine full of stories and artwork by Southern creatives. It was founded in 1964 by a professor named Charlene Swansea, and she edited the magazine until 1970 and then went on to create Red Clay Publishers, who printed 32 books, also by Southern writers, primarily women. And this is so relevant to the point of this video, but this lady is really cool, and I wanted to take a moment to shout her out. The article that I read about her mentioned that she lives in a yellow house, and that just brought me a lot of joy, so I wanted to share. Anyway, the short story, it is in the first person from the point of view of Violet, and it definitely feels a lot more like a parable of sorts than the stage adaptation does. It feels much smaller, and it makes the characters feel a bit more one-dimensional, though that is partially what the difference between story and stage can be, given that in written text it's easier to explain thought processes, and on stage it's easier to express emotions, which inevitably creates more depth in character, especially given that the story is only like 25 pages, so there isn't a lot of space to make up for that. There's a strong focus on this mirror imagery of her avoiding them or directly forcing herself to look at her face in mirrors as a sort of punishment. You also picture her as a lot younger, sort of expecting her to grow out of this focus on beauty without having this visual of what she looks like, even though she says at one point in the story that she's 28, which is 3 years older than she is in the show. Also, in the beauty conversation, it brings in a little about class as well, where she talks about how her hands aren't as soft and pretty because of all the work that she's done. The one main difference is that she ends up with Monty at the end. Flick feels a little bit like an afterthought who's just kind of there for like a slight metaphorical purpose. I mean, it's implied that she ends up with Monty. She gets off the bus, she avoids all the mirrors, and then she sees him. She decides to look at herself in mirrored glass, realizes she hasn't been healed, and then she runs off, and two of them run after her, and Monty catches her. There is the setup for her and Flick in the bedroom scene, but it's a much weaker connection and never really gets explored or brought up again. Also, she never meets the preacher. He's out of town. And there's a lot more disability language used proportionally to the rest of the text, but that makes sense given its parable format and the amount of text that there actually is to work with. In my opinion, at least, the musical is a very faithful adaptation. It captures the vibes perfectly. It just modernizes the themes a little bit, and it makes the world and the conflicts in that world a little bit bigger to pad the runtime effectively, but that makes it sound like it's a negative thing. I enjoy that they padded the runtime. I think having more in this story makes it a more impactful story. 12 years after the short story is published, we get the short film, which is about the same length as the original story, like pages to minutes. Again, seemingly nobody remembers the film exists, so it's kind of irrelevant to the point of this video, but I watched it, so now you have to know about it. They make her scar a burn from working on a car with her dad, rather than a split across her nose from an axe blade accident. And it looks like they visualize it. It looks like a bruise or a paint smudge rather than a scar. Overall, I felt very emotionally neutral about this film. I like the musical adaptation much better. It made me feel things. The film kind of didn't. But the two things that stuck out to me specifically was, first, how visualizing the afterthought that Flick is in the story makes him a complete third wheel that narratively says, oh, there's no universe where she'd actually show any interest in a black man. Why would you even imply that? Which was not my favorite. And the second thing was that this Violet feels very bland, almost to a degree of being like the innocent saint trope of disability for most of the story, and it just felt like a certain sparkle was missing from her, which I think may have been a combination of the script and the hyper-realism that is film as a medium, and also the sound design, but I didn't really connect to this version as much. But that brings us to the Playwrights Horizons production, which ran from March 11th to April 6th, 1997, and was filmed for the Theater on Film and Tape archive on March 26th. Toft doesn't film a lot of off-Broadway stuff, and I'm very curious as to why this specific show was chosen to archive, but I'm happy about it. They also archived the workshop version of the show that happened beforehand, but it currently is not available for restoration reasons, if I remember correctly, so I did not get a chance to see that, unfortunately. I also did not get to see the last, 10 to 15 minutes of the show because the file was corrupted or something, so that was tragic. Overall, I don't have a lot to say about this production since it's the plot that I gave you earlier, but certain things that popped out to me with this version was that it opened on Violet looking at herself in a mirror, and we sort of see this mirror imagery appear throughout, like in the story. That's not super present in the revival or specified in the script, so it's usually not in regional adaptations. Also, this version of Monty is not very nice, and not in the not nice boyish way that society usually tolerates, but genuinely I didn't enjoy him very much. They also had her father be very stern with her, and occasionally manhandle her or just be a little stronger with her, and she seemed a little bit afraid of him, in a way that clearly had love and parenting anxiety behind that, but I had assumed from the script that it was a much more lighter, wholesome relationship, so that really popped out to me. I was also really interested in Lauren Ward's Violet specifically. First, that they costumed her to have her hair pulled back and out of her face, which is a statement all in its own that we could discuss. Does this imply that she cares a little bit more about practicality than about how she looks? And that she's actually just focused on her appearance in one specific facet but not another one? Or maybe that the focus on her appearance is not necessarily what she's actually focusing on and there's something underneath that she's ignoring. Or is it just too hot out for her to have her hair down? Or did they decide to do this to make it clear to the audience that there isn't a scar on her face so that they can, the audience can map onto her face whatever they want to imagine? I have no idea. Fascinating. The other thing that I took a lot of notes on that we'll get to later is her physicality, and the way that she says her lines is deliberately ungraceful in a way that's meant to imply that she's lived in a tiny town in the mountains her entire life and never really interacted with people, and while she loves all of these picturesque perfect girls in the movies, she doesn't actually know how to act like one. But this also plays into the idea of beauty and what beauty is, and her being uncoordinated and overall behaving in a way that might be perceived as more masculine and also autistic coded as hell, but we're gonna just put that in our pocket for later, is a really interesting piece to tie into this, especially when we compare her to Sutton Foster's Violet in 2014, who has her hair down. She kind of hides behind her hair sometimes. She's hyper aware of every social situation, and she tries to control herself so much in those situations that she ends up making mistakes anyway, and she kind of folds in on herself and is much smaller physicality, which, given Sutton Foster's typical MO for characters, was very surprising to me. I was watching Lauren Ward's Violet and I went, oh, this makes sense as to why they cast Sutton for the revival. Got it. And then I went to watch the revival and I saw a completely different side of her that I loved, and it was so lovely. I was just very surprised by it. It also just reminds me how fun theater is, because the two of them had effectively the same script. There are some changes, but effectively the same script. But they played the emotions of it completely differently, which both ended up getting to the same message about this character at the end of the story anyway, but in a completely different path from point A to point B, which I think is beautiful. And what I found even more interesting about this is that when I interviewed Lee Silverman for this, who she directed that production. Hi Lee, thanks for watching. I sort of assumed that this was a deliberate directing change from the original, because a lot of things I researched thus far have been shows that everybody saw, or if they didn't, directors often go to the archives and watch other productions of it, and she never saw the original production. So this was just a completely different direction that appeared completely organically, which is even more fun, honestly. I love theater. I think it's amazing. I mean, obviously the original creative team that also worked with her had seen the original production because they wrote it, so some of those things may have been more deliberate, but still, I think it's super interesting. The other thing that I learned from Lee is that in making the script changes for the revival, they were only planning to do that one night concert. There was kind of no universe where they expected it to transfer to Broadway. It was well before Encore's things semi-regularly transferred. We just kind of expect that now, but that was not at all in the cards for them. So the changes that they made for the show were more of a loving return to the script to change things, because it felt organic and it felt like updating it for modern audiences rather than imagining it on a Broadway stage for a different target audience to try to make a profit. And I think that level of intention and care helped it retain this small, more informal chamber piece energy that this music has always sparkled with. The most major changes are that they turned it into a one act, which I think works so much better for this piece. They cut some things, like the fight with the suitcase doesn't happen. They changed some dialogue, they tightened the focus of the story, and they added 2 new songs. Also, Monty is like a likable golden retriever of a guy, which I think serves that narrative better, and the dad is a lot nicer to young Vi, which I also think serves the narrative better. And they also evened out the race aspects of it a bit. The original kind of leaned on like, well, I'm different and you're different, so we're the same and we both get it, in a fairly oversimplified way that was very common in the 90s and early 2000s, but is not as much now, because different kinds of oppression are not interchangeable, and we used to have like this colorblind aspect of you know, all the misfits are misfits, and now we're like, it's a little more nuanced than that. So they leaned into that nuance a little bit more, and also like specifically added a few more Violet saying well-meaning but very much ignorant and racist lines towards Flick that I think really helped that aspect of it age better. The theater that it transferred to, then the American Airlines Theater, now the Todd Hames Theater, is one of the smallest theaters on Broadway and has a very intimate feel, but it also has almost 6 times the amount of seats as the Playwrights Horizons main stage where the original production was, and yet they managed to stage it in a way that made it somehow feel smaller, despite having a much larger stage and a much larger audience. This version is also more abstract than the original production, which I think is part of why that happened. Overall, I found that this version feels a lot more clean and streamlined, which made the important pieces of the show shine a lot more than in the original, and at the end made me cry, which doesn't happen when I watch shows on tape, so I can only imagine what it would have been like in a theater. But also, I was 12 or 13 when this was on Broadway, so I don't think I would have quite got it to the degree that I do now. I very vividly remember watching them perform on the Tonys when I was little and trying to get it because I was like obsessed with Sutton Foster at the time, but I was very much in the like, I like shows that are sparkly, ooh, things for my brain kind of age group, so it didn't pop out to me. But anyway, that is our show. That's what we're going to be working with today, and let's talk disability. Also, as always, all of my sources are linked below if you're interested. Disability studies texts are super fun. I highly recommend reading them, not that I'm biased. Now, this show doesn't have much online discussion about it anywhere, so I have less of a grasp on how people view this piece outside of like various reviews of the show and my friends who primarily have a very specific disability bias, and the people I talked to who've worked on the show before, in comparison to like the other things that I've worked on, which have a lot more conversation around disability and also have a significant like bootlegs, and so that's why people have a cult following for it. Anyway, really the only buzz that I found around the show was from reviewers, and one thing that popped over reviews quite a few times was people wanting the show to focus more on Violet's despair. The famous word from the New York Times review of the off-Broadway production was underwhelming, and there has been a lot of other commentary about this narrative sort of lacking depth, which I think points to something so interesting about the fact that we expect stories about disabled people to be rooted in trauma, particularly stories whose narrative focuses on a cure. And we also expect that narrative to be primarily centered around that trauma and around that despair. We don't want to see much of the human beyond the disability because they're not meant to be a whole person, they're meant to be a metaphor. We get uncomfortable around disabled joy. And this show doesn't fit into that mold. Yes, a lot of the story is centered around her disability and her quest for a cure, but we really only get the narrative from her character individually, and we also get so much more of her outside of that quest. Yes, the reason she's in the situation is because of her disability, but she's also, you know, like playing poker and reflecting on her past and getting herself in a love triangle. Well, okay, it's a love V, it's not actually triangle. A triangle would insinuate. Okay, but that would be such a fascinating directorial decision. Can you imagine? Sorry, hello. My biggest fear going into the show, knowing nothing about it, was that it was going to say that it was about a disabled woman and name the show after her, but actually be about every single other person around her and what they learned from her struggles, and she was going to be completely one-dimensional. If you're new to disability media analysis, as a rule, any disability piece that is titled the name of the disabled character is not remotely about the disabled character, and they only exist to prop up the narratives of everybody else around them and have absolutely zero personality traits. But this show actually centers her and makes it her story, which is the logical choice given that the modern Western storytelling canon relies on an alienated person finding their chosen family and learning to be okay being different, but we typically only see disabled protagonists in that storytelling structure if they're autistic coded. Not specifically as autistic coded, because the idea of you're not wrong, just different is societally welcome for people who are just outside the norm, but not for those who are clinically outside of the norm. And also because if you're going to use disability in a story, you will historically make way more money if it's a slightly uplifting tragedy tragedy that makes the non-disabled viewer feel grateful for what they have. But Violet doesn't do that. Yes, we see ableism towards her, we see how that affects her throughout her entire life and creates the kind of person that she is, and that every character does acknowledge her scar at some point. Like, it's equally real to her as it is to everybody else. We're not implying that this is all in her head. But it does on some level become a story about internalized ableism and about being told a narrative so much by society about yourself that you start to believe it rather than being willing to craft a new narrative for yourself. And I think with any form of discrimination there is obviously a fine line. Like, you can't just bootstrap your way out of the patriarchy or out of racism or ableism. That's not how that works. But there also is power in learning to accept that what makes you different, while it may not be the easiest path, is the one to go down anyway, because homogeneity is boring, and also because practically a lot of these things are not things that we can change, so why dwell on them? That's not a good use of our time or energy. And the text also nods quite nicely to historical and religious views of disability that, if we're being honest with ourselves, haven't really changed. We've just gotten better at hiding them. With her implying in the first few minutes that Leroy refuses to look her dead in the face because the town is very superstitious, and the other line about how she was told the accident happened because they didn't go to church, both of which are examples of things people do to feel like they can control the uncontrollable, because most people's biggest fear is becoming suddenly disabled. What does that say about how we view disability? But we see a lot of myths around disability, and the causes of disability, particularly more victim-blamey ones, pop up for this specific reason. And then people like the TV Preacher prey on these myths to make a profit. And the self-awareness isn't the right word, but something to that effect, of this show effectively saying, you'd believe anything if you needed to bad enough, but that doesn't mean that that thing is true. And specifically pointing to the fact that people who distrust the medical system or who have had bad experiences with it turn in other directions, which in her case doesn't have super severe consequences beyond spending most of her life savings on that trip, but that's not really explored, nor did I don't think it really needed to be. But it did make me think about, like, the people who refuse life-saving medical care due to a distrust of the system, which is valid because the system is kind of a mess, but often that leads people into directions that might cause more harm than good. And that's a complicated and deeply nuanced conversation that we're not going to get into, but it definitely got me thinking about that, particularly because much of what we see from the Preacher is him speaking about eradicating disability in a very predatory, give me all your money kind of way. But then also at the end, having the Preacher and Virgil both try to tell her that's not entirely the case, and trying to point her towards a more nuanced understanding of God's plan, where not all things can be cured and not all things need to be, which to me made it clear how, like, this language is technically morally neutral, but then is often used quite easily in predatory and harmful ways. And obviously, like, that's something I'm hyper aware of as a disabled queer person. But the majority of the time that we see disability and religion, particularly Christianity, appear in the media canon together, it is in a super uncritically Jesus-y manner, and this more nuanced conversation is absolutely nowhere to be found. And there's something refreshing about this effectively, like, you're valid to be religious, but I hope you know you can't pray the gay away sort of narrative, especially in a period piece where it feels more distant and therefore gives more breathing room to handle that conversation in a less tense way. And also, especially in a Southern period piece, as somebody whose track record of, if you pray hard enough, you'll just suddenly be better, comments have almost been exclusively been from Southerners in my life. It also handles the intersections of identity quite well, in that a huge part of her disability is that society tells us women are only valuable for our desirability, and thus a girl who is not beautiful is not able to actually be a complete woman and is therefore disabled. Her focus on beauty is not it is vanity, let's be real, but it's more her clocking that every woman she has seen be successful or popular or famous or even liked is beautiful, and she has been told ever since the accident that she is ugly, and so she therefore does not see a world where she can be successful or popular or famous or desired. And of course, the word disabled and the word ugly have been synonyms for most of history, so adding disability into the discussion of what counts as beautiful is super poignant. We're gonna get back to that in a bit, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Also, in case I forget to mention this somewhere else, the fact that we see a disabled character be pursued by two men, and it's not a wholesome, barely even hold hands sort of pity, wait until marriage situation, meant a lot to me, because disabled people don't get to be sexual beings in media unless we're being sexualized, which primarily only happens when it's women who are manic pixie dream girls, or the, like, poor deaf or blind damsel in distress in a horror movie from the 60s. And this is neither of those things, which is a very large win. There's also some hint toward pretty privilege in that her scar impacts her ability to succeed in the world. We learned that she struggles with math because the students who were good at it had to go up to the board in front of the class, and she wanted to avoid that, so she deliberately stunted herself from being able to get better at the skill. There's also comments in the script that somewhat separate Violet from womanhood. One specifically that comes to mind is the "what kind of girl knows how to play poker like that" line. And as I mentioned earlier in the original story, she has that line about how she doesn't have soft and delicate hands like most pretty women do. We also see in both productions how her ungraceful tomboy-esque traits and temper sort of separate her from traditional views of womanhood or what a good woman should be. And in the original production, they really play this up even further with her physicality that at moments can only be described as like Elphaba in Dancing Through Life. It's very disjointed, it's jerky, kind of gangly and uncoordinated, or to use disability language, it's dyspraxic, which is super interesting because in media we tend to perceive dyspraxic movement and motion as autistic coded, or at least an indicator of autistic coding. And tying that back into womanhood, we often see the stereotype of autism as portrayed in women as hypermasculine. And in fact, there's a very pervasive theory that autism is actually the extreme male brain, which is both a patriarchy issue and also a diagnostic issue, and that it's much of the reason other presentations of autism remain undiagnosed, particularly in more marginalized groups. Not to bring us on a side quest, but this theory is pretty much debunked, not entirely, but it's up for question to a degree where it's treated as debunked, particularly since it relies on primarily anecdotal evidence. It also relies on the concept of men and women having intrinsically, fundamentally different brains, which is just not scientifically proven. I have a video about that up here if you want to watch it. Not to mention that, like, autistic people are much more likely to be trans than the general population in a way that does not serve this hypothesis. I'm not going to start ranting about Simon Baron Cohen right now because that's a whole side quest that's just wholly unnecessary and will get me very heated. I'm already heated, you can tell. Moving on. Anyway, the core of what I mean to say here is that because autism is primarily diagnosed in men and when a woman associated with masculinity, and we judge beauty and desirability in women based on femininity and a lack of masculine traits, autistic coding Violet becomes a whole other can of worms in regards to her wanting to become beautiful and being perceived as such. It's not just that she wants the symmetrical face without a scar, but she also wants to be perceived like the perfect dainty movie star of the time, which is based on both looks and behavior. And she sort of assumes that the behavior will fall into line once the looks happen, and she has to change her behavior now in order to survive because of how she looks. When these behaviors are also very much due to disability in a different direction than what she's imagining, and time period wise would not be able to imagine at this point in her life. In this era, young girls were being diagnosed as autistic very occasionally, like Temple Grandin was diagnosed in 1950, I think, but late diagnosis is a much more recent phenomenon, and if Violet were to get late diagnosed, it probably wouldn't be until the 80s or the 90s at the very earliest. But the other reason that I bring this up is because one thing I was clocking throughout this research process was that the autistic coding isn't just in this production. It's most noticeable to the modern eye, sorry to say modern eye about something from 1997, I know that's physically painful to hear, but it's this specific kind of coding that if we put it in media today, people would almost expect it to be explained and become explicit representation, so it's easy to spot. The 2014 version of autistic coding is the kind that really walks the line between whether I would make a judgment on it or not. I'm going to make a judgment on it because why not presume disability until proven otherwise? That makes things way more interesting. But in an academic sense, I could evenly source it in either direction pretty easily. But I actually first picked up on this when I was reading the short story because I couldn't tell if the writing style fits within the autism voice we see to an aggressive degree in the modern day. Think like Curious Incident, Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close, Counting by Sevens, etc. But has lots of examples throughout history like Ramona Quimby and Anne of Green Gables. And the reason I couldn't quite tell is because Violet as a character feels like an extension of Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables. So I wasn't sure if I was reading into this specific autistic voice cadence out of habit and picking up on a trope rather than a writing style. Either way, I don't love to analyze writing style because that may have been a deliberate choice to write in a certain way, or it may just be like that's how the writer talks. And I generally try to avoid speculating neurotype in real people where possible, and analyzing something so specific as speech or writing patterns gets dangerously close to that. I mean, for famous historical figures who I've read extensive writing from and know a lot about them as a person, that's a different conversation. But that's not the situation here. Anyway, the Anne of Green Gables overlap popped out to me immediately because, frankly, she was my only friend growing up, and she spends so much of her time worrying about her looks in a way that is also intrinsically tied to desirability. She's never been wanted by anybody before and has been called ugly for most of her life, and so she puts two and two together and she assumes that must be why nobody cares for her. Not that the world is cruel and bad circumstances just happen. And over time she grows out of this worry because she finds a loving family and friends and she feels like she's settled and happy where she is. And the way that Violet speaks about what is effectively the same situation feels almost identical to what we see from a young Anne Shirley, to the point where you forget that Violet's a 25-year-old woman, or 28 in the story, which sort of infantilizes her as a character, but at the trade-off of letting the audience see her world expand in real time, and also never once giving off the energy that it's implying that all disabled people want to be cured. It feels like a specifically Violet issue rather than a wider statement, which is really, really, really important, and probably accidental, but again, cannot emphasize this enough, really, really, really important. But the other thing about this overlap that I've been pondering has been about adaptation. There have been many an Anne of Green Gables adaptation, the 1985 one is the superior one, and I will happily die on that hill. But something that was really impactful for me as a kid was seeing this objectively gorgeous child go on and on about how she felt so insecure about her looks, because it made me think, oh, well, maybe I just don't know better yet. Like, I think that I'm ugly, but maybe I just don't know yet because look at her, right? But I also know that for other kids, there are some illustrated versions of Anne of Green Gables where she's made to be less conventionally attractive, and they felt more seen in those versions of Anne for the exact opposite reason. And obviously, beauty is super subjective, but I think there are worlds where, in crafting physicality for this character, making her as conventionally feminine and gorgeous as possible has just as much importance and merit as does making her sort of awkward and messy and unkempt. And I think both productions kind of had pieces of both of these depending on the moment, but the physicality differences really stood out to me in showing two different sides of the exact same narrative. But let's talk about the scar. In the back of the script there's a note from book writer Brian Crawley titled A Word About the Scar. I'm just going to read this to you and then let us discuss. After our first production of Playwrights Horizons, we discovered the scar issue can be a volatile one. Reviewers usually mention it, some approvingly, some not. Audiences at talkbacks always bring it up, and while most people seem to love the scar's absence, some are adamant that it ought to be visible. So I felt a word explaining our intentions might be helpful. Janine Tesori and I wanted to write Violet together because the story spoke so deeply to us and because it seemed to require a non-literal presentation. Director Susan H. Schulman was also taken with it, and early on the three of us talked about what shape the piece might take. We considered splitting Violet into two parts, one actress playing the beautiful ideal version and the other the scarred reality. Susan worried about the burden this idea would put upon casting the piece. As soon as we cast two adult actresses, she pointed out, we'd be making a literal statement as to what we thought beauty and ugliness were and taking away an audience's opportunity to decide this for themselves. I also want to pause and say, Lee did say that this was discussed heavily again for the revival. More on that in a bit. I wondered what would happen if instead we split the character into her adult self and the girl she was at 13. Once puberty strikes, a lot of bright, talented, talkative girls seem to become shy and self-conscious, toning themselves down in response to boys. Perhaps with these two, we could examine Violet's scar in its universal as well as its particular aspects. Excited by the idea, we soon agreed the most theatrical approach would be to not represent the scar at all. We weren't about to drive a bus on stage, why not leave the scar to the imagination as well? I suppose someone could write an excellent stage adaptation of The Ugliest Pilgrim that depended upon having a great big scar on Violet's face, but that's not what we did. I could imagine a scar being featured indirectly in reflections on mirrored set surfaces maybe, or projections on its walls. This would take a cue from Doris Bett's story in which mirrors are prominent. There is a stage direction late in Act 2 suggesting Flick hold open a door in the Fort Smith bus station. The son makes a funhouse mirror of the glass door. In it, Violet sees her own image reflected. Perhaps this is the one time we see her face, scar and all, as she sees it. She stares at herself, too stunned to speak. When the glass door closes, the spell is broken. But using a cosmetic scar in the piece we've written isn't feasible. Young Vi appears in scenes before and after the accident. She'd have to run backstage repeatedly to put a scar on or take it off. At one point during the bus ride, Violet daydreams that young Vi is healed by the preacher's touch. What else could he do but pull the scar off of young Vi's face? Violet believes herself to be healed in Tulsa in the second act, and isn't disabused of the idea until she sees Monty at Fort Smith. If she wears a scar for the whole act, the audience will be impatient during the entire scene preceding the finale, knowing that whatever she herself might think, there is no possibility that she's been healed. But if she's taken off her usual scar temporarily, Monty has to come up with a clever way to sneak it back onto her face. In the second production we did together at a contemporary theater in Seattle, Susan used a slide with an abstract image of a scar toward the end. It was quite an effective solution to a problem the three of us were never completely convinced was important. A production that relied on projections might even make good use of scar images throughout the evening. But makeup? There's no need for it. Now the first thing is, I do agree with the logistics problem here. I do not think that there are as many pre-scar scenes for young Vi in the one-act version. It's only one or two, so it's more logistically probable, but I'm gonna trust the creators and the directors of the show on this one. They know the logistics of staging it way better than I do. Not to mention that the suspense at the end of the show where she thinks her scar is gone but actually it isn't, obviously would not work as well were it made literal, which would sort of hinder the emotional impact of that moment, which really needs to hit precisely right for the overall message of the piece to carry. I don't think it would be impossible to stage that in a way where it would be hidden really well, but it would be quite difficult. I do think that, like, if we're so willing to suspend our disbelief that there is a scar, why can't we be willing to suspend it in the other direction? But then there's still a casting strain, because while there are many talented actors in the universe with facial differences, the likelihood of finding a young Vi and an adult Violet with even semi-similar facial differences that also line up generally with what's written in the script, that also can sing the score, which is not the easiest material, who also happen to be available at the same time and also want to do the show, is a lot of things happening at once. But also, suspension of disbelief, it's theater, and I don't see why this couldn't happen even if none of these things fully lined up. But I will also say that there are certain disability shows that certain groups of disabled people do often avoid, because once you get cast in them, you get sort of pigeonholed. Glass Menagerie and Curious Incident are the two main ones that I could think of. So I don't know if the facial difference community avoids the show in particular, though it's much less frequently done in comparison to the other two, but that may also be a problem for, like, scarcity issues. But either way, including visible disability would affect the universality of the piece, which they kind of comment on, but I do have thoughts thoughts on that. We're gonna get to those in a bit. One thing I do want to say that I have not stopped thinking about since I learned about this from Lee in our interview is that people remember there being a scar in the 2014 version. She has had people reach out and ask her who did the makeup for the scar. People generally remember it as having existed on the stage. And part of why she chose not to literalize it is because she knew audiences would imagine something worse than what they could make possible with makeup and prosthetics, which obviously is very much the case given how people remember the show, which kind of makes me lean farther into like the theatrical choice of not having a visible scar, because I've seen other disabilities in other things portrayed using physicality or prosthetics in a way that has made me very uncomfortable and taken me out of the piece, because I'm thinking about like, what are the logistics of how that was done? I'm thinking about how obvious it is that a non-disabled actor is playing a disabled character and they're caricaturizing it. I'm taken out of the story a little bit by these things, and I now see how that sort of carries over here to the show and how that would have definitely changed my perception of the show while watching it. I also agree that splitting adult Violet into two Violets would create a weird situation, though for very different reasons. The idea that doing so is creating a literal statement on beauty and ugliness feels a little bit like wishful thinking to me. Not necessarily that every single person is going to go, oh, they have a facial difference, they're ugly. But from a disability perspective, the laws in place in this country until 1974 in some places that prevented visibly disabled people from being able to go out into public without threat of institutionalization were called the ugly laws. Ugly and disabled have been interchangeable words until very, very recent history, so that dichotomy of ugliness and beauty is already present enough, and it is in the language of the text already. That doesn't feel like a valid enough reason to make specific casting choices, in my opinion. Violet decides and names what her dichotomy of beauty and not beauty is, and the story itself implies that society may look at her a little differently, but that doesn't change her worth or desirability as a person. So either way, I don't think the presence or lack thereof of a scar would make any further statement beyond that in that specific direction. That being said, I do think splitting it up would create a situation of inside every disabled person there's a non-disabled person waiting to be freed, which creates a dichotomy of normal and abnormal, which is a wholly different situation, particularly because that idea is already very much in the theater canon. I'm blanking on which one it is. It's one of the ones that I've analyzed recently. But it already very much exists of the idea of like having a non-disabled and a disabled person, and it's the non-disabled person that's in the head of the disabled person that's waiting to break out, and that's just not the greatest narrative to continue. Editing Sydney here. I found it. It's in my Tommy video, and I'm gonna just include a clip from that in here because I think that honestly what I said there better transitioned to the next thing in this video than what I wrote in my script. So great. There's also the question of the way that this is staged, looking like every disabled person has an inner abled person who wants to jump out the moment that a cure comes along, rather than our inner selves very much being tied to our disabled experiences. Like, I do feel like I have like an abled Sydney as a shadow who every now and then will tell me how much more productive I would be if I were not disabled, but that doesn't feel like a part of me that exists. That feels like a version of me that society has created for me that I do my best to ignore because she's not helpful. I just misgendered my shadow self. Honestly, my shadow self would probably not be trans. Anyway, the overall narrative relies on the assumption that disabled people are constantly miserable and want to be cured, and that being cured is what makes us free, which is a problem. And the concept of disability itself is supposed to represent a limited point of view, which then is expanded once he is cured of that disability, which first of all, if your metaphor is meant to use a disabled person to help a non-disabled person understand a concept, what are all the disabled people supposed to do with that information, and where do we fit in here? My one main critique about the show that I don't think I'd be pointing out if we had a much more extensive disabled theater and general media canon than we do, is the use of disability as metaphor. One of the articles I read for this, titled The New Freak Shows, quoted playwright Christopher Shin and saying, pop culture is more interested in disability as a metaphor than disability as something that happens to real people. And I think that very much carries across here in like most discussions of the show talk about what her scar represents rather than what Violet feels as a person, which both dehumanizes Violet and also sort of minimizes the fact that disabilities are not just like a confidence hurdle. They are things that impact how the world treats you and they make life difficult. That's why they're called disabilities. Particularly, one article, I don't remember which one it was, specified that the fact that we never see her scar implies that actually it only matters to her and that beauty isn't about how others perceive you, but it's about how you perceive yourself, which very much is not entirely the case. We see everybody else judge her and comment on her scar the entire show. It's not like her being confident makes her immune from ableism. Sure, it makes it less obvious in that bus ride home, but it's still present to some degree. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking some sort of message from this story. It has a lot of commentary around faith and desirability and hope and trauma and forgiveness and chosen family, but any and all focus on this disability exists as a metaphor that is separate from the person/character at hand gets very sketchy very quickly. Not to mention that this is one of the very few pieces of the disability canon where facial difference is used for anything other than a revenge plot, and we should definitely be appreciating the show more for that and for what it is as representation. But due to its casting history, we don't view it as representation, which is a shame, honestly. And I'm not necessarily saying that there's anything wrong with the piece on this. I think it handled it quite well, and it is an adaptation of an already existing piece from a wholly different time in the disability canon, but it is a trope that I want to point out because at the very least we can talk about it differently, in a way that doesn't treat disabled people like they exist to teach us a lesson about what it means to be a person, rather than disabled people exist to be people, because we are people. But that brings us to the last section, which is the okay now what section. And this is usually where I will suggest script changes or things to ponder while staging a piece to maybe handle the disability a bit better. But again, I generally think the show is actually fine as is. The only things I would suggest as alterations are the alterations that are made for the 2014 revival, so then it comes down to whether it's the 2-act version or the 1-act version that gets licensed, and depending on which website I go to, that's unclear. But were I to stage the show, I think it might be fun to see what would happen if there is a version where the cast is entirely visibly disabled in some manner, and so it really does become a conversation around internalized ableism and self-confidence and finding chosen family, because like, so many of us grew up as the only or one of the only disabled kids in our area, and being able to be surrounded by people like you and then unpack those specific experiences completely changes your confidence level. And that's effectively the story that we already have at hand here. And leading into that narrative a lot more would be really interesting. And also, like, most of the more ableist characters in the show are older people, so there also could be some conversation around how many older people have disabilities but refuse to acknowledge that they are disabled people, and then continue ableism toward younger people despite them having the exact same symptom profiles. There would need to be a little bit of suspension of disbelief around the soldiers being visibly disabled, given that they're both still in active duty and Monty heads to the special forces at the end of it, but like, I don't think suspension of disbelief is too much of a hurdle. This is a very like ethereal, expressionistic show, so you can totally play with that, and I don't think anybody's gonna really care. B, we don't actually learn a ton about what Flick's up to, and he's meant to be a more seasoned veteran just moving posts, so this could fit into his character. Also, visible disability does not have to be a mobility issue or using ASL. It could also mean that he has a facial difference or something that would not impact his ability to be in the military. I would keep the scope of what disabilities are used and shown here within a period-specific view of disability, if that makes sense. Like, I think trying to move the show into modern day would really mess with the race aspects of it, so it really needs to stay very obviously as a period piece in the 60s. So that means, like, we could have a guide dog, but we couldn't have a service dog, for example, but I think it would be really cool. But weirdly specific staging idea aside, my general thing would be that if the choice is to continue to not have somebody with a facial difference in the role, I do think this might be a situation where, for equity reasons, disabled people are cast in this role going forward. Obviously, disabilities are not interchangeable and experiences greatly differ. We talked about this with Hunchback, how like somebody with a limp or a facial difference is going to come at that role from a completely different angle than an otherwise non-disabled deaf person might. But I think that's as close as we could get to equitably casting the show and it not being a story that capitalizes on disability aesthetics without actually including disabled people. Actually tying in the autistic coding discussion from earlier, maybe making her more deliberately autistic at a time when somebody like her would remain undiagnosed would also be narratively fascinating, because she is so focused on curing one disability but wholly unaware that she could have another one, because that wasn't even on her radar back then. That wasn't on anybody's radar back then. And that one also very much cannot be fixed in the way that her facial disability also cannot be fixed. That would be fascinating. But anyway, that is all that I have on this show. I highly recommend checking out the cast recording in your free time because it is incredible. I feel like I've already said this somewhere, but in case I have not, Janine Tesori has a way of writing music that just feels like a hug. So do that. She's really good at vibes. Like, her music is just vibes. Vibes. I love her. Also, speaking of her work, I took down my Kimberly Akimbo analysis recently because I made it like a year and a half ago and I disagree with some of my opinions and feel like it wasn't to the level of academic standard that I want to have for this series. I'm hoping to redo it either January or February. So if you're wondering where that went, that's why. Sorry, not actually that sorry. I'm gonna make a better one. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them below. A huge portion of what I research does not end up in these videos for timing and flow reasons, and I'm always happy to answer your random questions. I'm also making a little vlog on the process of making one of these videos to bring you on this research adventure that will be out later this month, so stay tuned for that if you want to see this entire process from start to finish. And yeah, as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.